Hello, I'm Sean, fellow with the National Board of Fitness Examiners, and today I'm going to be reviewing an article written by Hutchinson that was published in outsideonline.com called "The Case Against Stretching." I'm going to offer a rebuttal to this because I do not believe that he looked at the research appropriately, and want to share with you all of those reasons why, and then what the actual truth of stretching is. And at the end, or towards the end at least, I'm going to talk a little bit about this science experiment that'll actually prove to you, like a science experiment that you can do, that'll actually prove what the efficacy of stretching is. So, without further ado, let's go into this. So he wrote this article and said, quote, "Anointing flexibility as one of the 5 major components of physical fitness gives it undeserved importance and leads people, including apparently personal trainers, to spend time that could otherwise be devoted to other activities with far better return on investment." Now, as I stated, I actually wrote about this in a rebuttal. So as I stated, I basically explain the different misunderstandings, and I actually have all this on an article. If you'd rather read the article, it's on jrtfit.com in my blog section, so feel free to go there. You can follow along with me as well. But basically, he notes, quote, "According to the research that Nuzzo summarizes, greater flexibility as measured by the sit and reach test isn't associated with longer life." Now, he's talking about how this Nuzzo basically looked through these 300 plus studies, but they're all cohort studies. Okay, a cohort study is basically a study that looks at a lot of numbers. They don't actually do a double-blind, placebo, or single-blind study. They don't conduct something in person. They look at data and they attempt to basically extrapolate from that data a possible correlation between the 2 data points. So I want you to think about that logically for a second, where if basically well, just imagine how first it would be, how you would have to essentially do a study like that pertains to specifically what he's talking about, a longer life. So you'd have to actually put groups of people in a box and control absolutely every variable of their life, except for one of the groups will do sit and reach test, for example, and the other ones won't. And that's it. That's the only difference between the 2. And then the ones that did sit and reach lived a lot longer. And that's obviously absurd. That's not going to happen. So, and it's important to note that just because something appears to have a correlation does not mean that there is one. And just the same, just because something appears as if there isn't a correlation does not mean that there isn't one. The purpose of cohort studies is to figure out how, or basically what's most important to study next, and you can look at the data and everything else. I actually linked this really funny website pertaining to this, where it's called, like, if you do a Google search for spurious correlations, it'll come up, and it shows absurd correlations that couldn't possibly be connected, but the data points actually match up, showing that it is, which obviously it's not, but it just shows the absurdity of using this type of data in order to prove, quote unquote, anything. So let's see, from there, he also went on to say that people doing the sit and reach stretch basically test doesn't prevent against falls. Once again, we can't say that. And in reality, he correlates that to injury, stating that there doesn't appear to be evidence that stretching actually prevents injury. Well, I can tell you from personal experience from my clients and patients that this does absolutely, stretching does specifically prevent injury. And I'll explain a very simplistic example, there are numerous examples, but a very simple one is if your inner thigh is overactive, we'll just call it tight for ease. So you have the inner thigh muscles extremely tight, your adductors. Those muscles will pull your femur bone inward all the time. So whether you're sitting, walking, climbing stairs, anything like that. So climbing stairs, for example, with a knee in, with your knee valgus, that actually has been shown to increase the amount of stress on your ACL, your anterior cruciate ligament. So by stretching that and then going up those stairs, you immediately take stress off of the ACL. So right there you can show stretching can prevent pain. So there are numerous other examples of that, but and we'll kind of talk about a couple of other ones. Like I want to talk a little bit about plantar fasciitis in a little bit, but it can help with lower back pain, although most of the time people basically that tell you to stretch the lower back, that's not the best idea, even with lower back pain. You actually want to stretch other muscles, such as your latissimus dorsi, lats, and your hamstrings, and that actually can significantly decrease the amount of lower back pain, and depending on what the cause is, of course. And you have other examples as well, thoracic outlet syndrome, which is a shoulder issue, for example, due to tight muscles. So by loosening those muscles, you actually prevent that pain, usually caused from an overactive, so overuse, I should say, of movement. So repetitively swimming, for example, in the same positions without doing opposing motions. It can help with knee pain. It can help with migraines, even, which, you know, that one seems kind of strange to people, but a lot of people shrug all the time, so those tighten up those muscles that actually head up your trapezius levator scapulae, and by having those tight or overactive, that can actually inhibit blood flow. So by inhibiting blood flow, that can actually lead to headaches and migraines. And that can be due to other things, of course, as well, but that's the easiest attempt at a fix that someone should start with because it's free, obviously. So numerous different things. And then Alex goes on to write that being flexible doesn't improve your sports performance. And technically, as stated, that's correct. So if you're overly flexible, that can actually hinder your sports performance. But that doesn't mean that if you're really tight, that stretching to get your muscles to what should be basically their neutral cross bridge position, that wouldn't actually improve your performance, your athletic performance. So he goes on to note that you decrease strength for a temporary period of time, which is true. And I note this 2010 study that actually talks about that. And I list a lot of studies in this article as far as if you want to read further. So please go to my website and check those out. And I'll put them actually at the link of the bottom of this video and audio as well. So videos on YouTube, audio I'll put on whatever I can. And this specifically looked into, this was specifically looked into after many studies that noted a higher injury rate for those that, you know, that were basically stretched before running. So, and I link a video, or link a study there as well, where they figured out that essentially by stretching before you run, you end up increasing your risk of injury. So the ones who stretched had a higher injury rate, for example, than the ones who did not stretch. And all of us were scratching our heads going, well, that's the opposite of what we thought would happen. But it's likely not due to the neuromuscular signaling that Alex notes. It's actually because of how the muscles are actually set. So for example, you have these protein filaments, you have the actinomycin filaments that contract, and they sit with a cross bridge. They sit basically like your fingers crossed, and they go together and apart. In the neutral position, they're still overlapped. In a stretch position, they're not. And this was even noted back in as early as 1994, talking about the length-tension relationship. And essentially after that point, you end up decreasing the amount of contractions that you end up seeing pretty significantly right away. So right when you go past that point, once there are a lot of cross bridges that are not cross-bridged, once they're separated, then you decrease your ability to actually contract those muscles pretty significantly. And the muscle in the optimal position then, if you stretch that, that's going to end up going too far apart and putting yourself in that position that is not very optimal. However, if you're too tight and you stretch it and it goes into the optimal position, then that will actually help your performance, for example. So I first wrote about this actually in 2008 with my provisional patent application and later publishing it in 2009. Pinto and all actually talked about this as well in 2012, and they said, quote, "The tension produced by the entire muscle fiber can thus be related to the length of an individual sarcomere, which is related to the joint angle. Within the optimal range of sarcomere lengths, the maximum number of cross bridges can form, and the tension produced is greatest." And I link that study here as well. And this actually confirms the rationale that I mentioned, that stretching overactive muscles will help correct your posture, or your position. I shouldn't say posture, your position of the actual muscle. Since stretching actually decreases contractions, doing so on muscles that basically want to help too much with things will decrease the amount that they will actually help. So let's take the specific example of plantar fasciitis. So plantar fasciitis is heel pain. I don't have to tell those of you who suffer or have suffered from it. Very excruciating, a lot of pain, difficult to do anything, including walk when you have it. And they basically give you a lot of orthotics, or they'll give you a boot, or they'll give you stretches, things like that to help. They'll tell you to roll an ice ball underneath your foot. And eventually when all those, usually the orthotics help for about 10 to 20 years. And then after that, since you didn't fix the muscle imbalance that actually causes it, then you end up with more pain, and they go to cortisone shots and eventually surgery. So, but what I'm telling you is that since most of the time plantar fasciitis is actually caused from a muscle imbalance, you can actually address it by simply fixing that muscle imbalance. So for example, your calf muscles, so the backs of your lower legs, so your gastrocnemius, soleus, plantaris, those are all overactive or tight. And the front shin muscles are usually underactive. So the tibialis anterior, for example. Having this imbalance, tight and loose we'll call it, makes it so that the tight calves actually pulls up the calcaneus bone, the heel bone. Pulling that calcaneus bone up stretches the plantar fascia that is underneath the foot, and then that is what creates the pain when you move and use it too much while it's in a stretched state. Things don't work very well in a stretched state. So that is what causes the majority of the pain of plantar fasciitis. And so yes, stretching helps with that. Of course, you need to stretch pretty often in order to actually make a significant difference. But you also need to work out the tibialis anterior, which I have people do on a treadmill while holding on, walking backwards in an incline, and excuse me, and pulling their toes up as much as possible, because it's more of an endurance muscle that you have to work. And you can do it in numerous other ways as well, but the important thing is working that out enough, as well as stretching the calves enough, actually does correct the muscle imbalance, which ends up making it so that you don't have any heel pain. And I've actually helped numerous people that used to suffer from plantar fasciitis, and on average it ends up getting completely better for them by 4 to 6 weeks. Once you address the muscle imbalance that causes it, the pain ends up subsiding and going away, and then they don't notice anymore, which is fantastic. Now shin splints with runners actually can be caused from the same thing, just pulling the actual tibialis anterior, for example, off, which makes your cartilage that connects the muscle to the actual tibia, you feel it a little bit more than you should. That's one of the causes of shin splints, caused by the same thing. So But yeah, this muscle imbalance where one side, basically an antagonist, is tight, where the other antagonist is the opposing muscle basically is loose. That was first mentioned in 1912 with Davis's law. So this is not something I made up. This is something that's been known for a very long time. And it's important to note that everything that I've been talking about here is with static stretching, which is you doing your stretching yourself and holding it for a minimum of 20 seconds. So I usually tell people that with really tight calves, for example, with plantar fasciitis, to stretch it for about a minute each time. And that's just so they can get enough of it, and we'll talk about that in a second. But there's also a type of stretching called PNF, which is proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. So PNF in research has been shown to actually work better than static stretching. A lot of times that's done with a passive stretch by a practitioner, someone who knows what they're doing. Don't do it with people who don't. Like, don't have someone do it for you. I actually link an article on my website that explains a way that you can actually do it yourself as well. It's a study, so the lingo's quite a bit higher than what most articles you may read are, but it has a very good description of how to actually do PNF stretching on your own as well. So dynamic stretching is the other type of stretching that Alex mentioned, and he actually said that you should do dynamic stretching instead of static stretching, and you should do it as basically a warm-up. Now, I have never found evidence that shows that dynamic stretching is actually better or effective at all in a sense. Like, we have evidence that shows that doing a dynamic stretch versus a static stretch is better, but that doesn't mean dynamic stretching is something that we still should do. That still could mean that it's worse than doing just another type of cardiovascular warm-up. And I think that a lot of people don't really understand that connection, where just because we've been doing it for a very long time does not mean that it's the best thing that you can possibly do. And I would recommend personally to think of it this way. So you have your static stretch, like I told you, hold it for at least 20 seconds. A lot of people hold it for 20 to 30 seconds. With dynamic stretching, you're doing it very quickly. So each stretch only lasts maybe 0.1, 0.2 seconds. And from there, they do 10 to 15 reps. So you're overall stretching a lot less than if you do a static stretch. So I'd still stress that you are stretching a muscle, which we know decreases your ability to actually perform properly. So why does it have an effect is the question, a positive effect? Well, you're also doing a cardiovascular warm-up. Doing a cardiovascular warm-up actually increases something called synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is a lubricator for your joints. It's like oil on a joint, for example, that keeps from friction. If we have too much friction, we end up with pain. So a lot of people take glucosamine, for example, which actually creates glycosaminoglycans, and then it turns into that, and that is the precursor for the synovial fluid. So, but cardiovascular exercise also does that. So performing a cardiovascular warm-up will actually make it so that you can release more synovial fluid. So I personally believe that this is the reason why doing these dynamic warm-ups actually ends up helping with joints, whereas a cardio warm-up would probably do better as well as actually increase the performance. So I don't recommend the butt kicks and high knees and things like that, for example. And from there, let's talk now about the science experiment that I promised. So what you're going to do is you're going to do an exercise. So for example, do a pull down. So pull down or pull up, whatever you want to do, where you're pulling a bar down to your chin and then bringing it back up. And that exercise, for example, is supposed to work the latissimus dorsi, your lats. It also will work the biceps, it'll work posterior deltoid, it'll work other things if you're holding your scapula in the right position. But in a lot of cases, a lot of people actually have very tight trapezius and levator scapulae muscles up here in the neck. And having those tight actually makes it so that they end up helping a lot with those muscles. Other times people actually have their biceps kick in a lot more than their lats. So they'll feel, for example, their biceps pulling a lot instead of their lats. And so do one set of that or one set of something where you don't feel the muscle that you're supposed to feel that's supposed to do the majority of the work, if you are the type of person that actually can feel a muscle. Now that's the one stipulation of this, is if you can't feel a muscle, then this won't work for you, obviously. But there are definitely a percentage of people out there that can't really feel much of anything. There are some people that can only feel lactic acid. So for those guys, this won't work. But for those of you who can actually feel what's happening with the muscles, with the contractions, this is for you. So after you do the first set, stretch the muscles. So stretch the trapezius or stretch the biceps, and then do a set of that exercise again. And you'll notice that those immediately will not help as much. It'll immediately make it so that you'll change a little bit, and it won't be hugely significant, but you'll be able to notice an immediate change in how your muscles work. Well, that proves right there that stretching decreases the ability for your muscles to contract, which is actually positive when you have these muscle imbalances, these muscles that want to take over when they shouldn't. So that shows the best time to actually stretch, and shows really the efficacy of stretching as well. So in the long run, you actually need to stretch at least 5 times a week and for at least 5 minutes for the whole week. So if you at least do 1 minute 5 times a week, for example, of an overactive muscle, that has been shown in this 2018 study to actually make it so that you will end up increasing your flexibility. And so in conclusion, stretching is absolutely necessary for people who have muscle imbalances. And in my personal practice, that's every single human being that I've ever met. Do not ever trust any cohort study for showing proof or evidence of anything, because that's not even what the point is of those. Static stretching is good, PNF stretching is even better, and I would not recommend dynamic stretching, so please figure something else out. Thank you, and if you enjoyed this video, please let me know. If you have any questions or want me to look up any other topic, put it down in the comments. Let me know what you're interested in and show me links to different articles, and I'd be happy to look into different things. So thank you very much. Have a great day.